Good morning, everybody. This is Natasha Duarte. We're just going to give another few seconds to let a few more people join before we get started with our webinar today. All right, we do want to start on time because we have a bit of material that we want to get through. So I'm going to go ahead and for those of you who are just coming on, we're just going to do a little introduction to start us off. First, thanks everybody for joining us today for a webinar about getting started with community composting. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I coordinate with Partners for Compost and Soil Health related outreach and education projects and represent CAV and policy initiatives. I'm joined today by Libby Weiland from the Vermont Community Garden Network and Athena Lee Bradley from the Northeast Recycling Council. As statewide network coordinator for Vermont Community Garden Network, Libby supports Vermont's community and school garden network. She works most directly with garden leaders, building their skills, confidence, and access to resources for their garden groups through training, technical support, grants, and networking opportunities. Athena is the projects manager and organic specialist for the Northeast Recycling Council. She organizes and conducts trainings on food scraps, organics, and manure management, develops training resources, and provides technical assistance to communities, businesses, and institutions. I want to start by orienting you to the GoToWebinar system. To the left is the viewer through which you'll see the presentation, and to the right is the GoToWebinar control panel where you can raise your hand, ask questions, and select audio mode. I also want to note that the attendee control panel will collapse automatically when not in use. So if you want to keep it open, you can click the View menu and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. Handouts can be downloaded at any time during the webinar. All attendees are muted, so please submit questions and comments through the questions panel at any time. Athena and I will be monitoring the questions throughout the webinar and we'll get through as many as possible, but if we aren't able to answer all of the questions, one of us will get back to you by email. All attendees will receive a link from GoToWebinar with the recording and slide deck after the webinar is finished. We'd like to extend a special thanks for the financial support received from the High Meadows Fund, the Grassroots Fund, participating Vermont Solid Waste Districts, and the USDA, which is supporting Athena's contributions to this project. Community-scale composting and feeding food scraps to laying hens are two organic management options gaining support in Vermont. Although today's webinar is focused more broadly on getting started with community food scrap composting, it was developed as part of a 3-year pilot project to develop, monitor, and evaluate small-scale food scrap composting systems at community gardens. Vermont's almost 400 community gardens offer a compelling opportunity to jumpstart localized food scrap management by creating a new norm in a familiar location. These gardens are also often sites for community education and offer a familiar location to connect with the surrounding non-gardening community. The pilot project will assess the feasibility of using community gardens for food scrap composting and identify what organizational and technical challenges they may face in increasing their composting capacity. And with that little bit of background, I'm going to turn it over to Libby, who will start us off.
Great, thank you, Natasha. And thank you all for joining us. Really excited to have you here today and get going on this, this project. Oh, and I need to show my screen, sorry about that. All right, so as you all dive into your project preparations for community composting, you know, your first thought should go towards what you'll need to put into it and what you hope to get out of it. a couple things I just want to highlight really quickly on this slide. First, those inputs. You know, a lot of our thoughts immediately go towards what type of bins do we need, what equipment do we need to make sure we have in place, feedstocks that we need to make sure we have a steady source supply for. But something that I think that sometimes gets a little neglected, or at least gets kind of a little further down the list, is that very important piece of people's time, really crucial piece to input to making these sorts of projects work, which I will get more into in just a minute here. On the output side of things, of course, there's compost. You know, the valuable soil amendment is a huge piece of this, but so much more in terms of benefits and outputs that you can get out of these community compost projects. Just to emphasize, really taking the time to discuss with your group what you hope to achieve through community composting. And by thinking about some of those goals and outcomes that you're looking for, that's really going to guide who you involve in the project, how your system's set up and how it's used, and all of that. You know, just a quick example, education, you know, if that's sort of your primary focus for your community composting project, you're going to want to focus really heavily on really great, clear signage. Make sure your system is really easy to explore, so that whatever age you're trying to approach with the compost learning, that they can easily explore. If your focus is community engagement, you're going to want to make sure you have lots of opportunities for people to get involved. So really just taking the time to think about it first and foremost is super important. And as Natasha mentioned, so Athena will be diving into the more technical aspects of community composting, and we'll spend a lot of the webinar on that. But it was important to us that we focused on people first. Like I said, really important piece of this, these projects. So before you even start to build your management team, make sure you reach out to the community, whatever that means, your community. So that might mean if you're in a community garden, that might mean your gardeners. If you're in a school setting, that's of course your school community. And then, you know, wherever you are, making sure that you approach your neighbors. Those are the people who are probably going to be the most concerned about you know, smells and pests and things like that. Just making sure that you take the time to not just inform them, but also get input and feedback from them. That will help people feel more invested in the project at a deeper level. And then, of course, no matter what's going on in terms of complaints or issues in your compost system, make sure that you engage and act upon them in a timely manner. That's important to keep a good relationship with your neighbors and your community there, and keep a good system going. And it's also why your management team is so important in this process. Again, people. When we talk about compost site management, I like to think of it sort of as a feedback loop. So a well-supported compost system, so lots of people making it happen, is going to be a well-managed compost system. It's going to be, you know, operating well, that sort of thing, you know, for the most part. I would say the kind of the opposite of that is also true. So a well-managed compost system is going to be a well-supported compost system. So if you have a weedy pile that smells and is just difficult to get into, chances are you're going to have less people. You might even lose some people who were originally involved in terms of keeping it well supported. So thinking about that feedback loop, making sure that everyone clearly understands their roles, that roles are communicated, and what tasks are needed to be done are communicated well, super important. And then in terms of your compost team, compost sites should have at least one compost site manager committing at least one time a week at the project. It's going to vary, and I'm a big advocate for teams, but making sure you at least have that in place. And then your success was dependent upon, kind of, so you have your management, but then delegation and support from compost volunteers, committing at least once a month to these projects. Of course, that's going to vary depending on your project, depending on your food source, all of those things, but just to make sure you at least have those things in place. And then even if your gardeners or your community members are not necessarily helping with the compost maintenance directly, making sure that they know how they can participate, making sure that the training and orientation is there for anyone who's interested and might be involved in it. So getting to those all-important compost site managers, these incredible dedicated folks. So really you're looking at overall management of the operation. If you are involved with a community garden, this is going to be very similar to the role of a garden coordinator or garden manager, so kind of overseeing systems. Again, I'm going to just emphasize that value of a team. There are lots of systems that work well with one person kind of at the helm and with lots of volunteers, but when you have a team in place, that you can kind of work to different people's strengths. So some important pieces would be someone that has some composting background, or at least knows how to access when there's troubleshooting that needs to happen, ensuring proper system maintenance, sourcing materials, that sort of thing. And then also making sure that there are people in your sort of management team that are good at communicating with volunteers, know how to recruit and train, schedule, delegate, keep communications going, that sort of thing. And then for your support, your compost team and helpers. So this is just an example list of the sorts of things that that your compost volunteers can help you with. It will just depend on your operation. But one thing I'll emphasize is just allow for varying levels of involvement. A really great example that I saw when I was visiting Manhattan recently at La Plaza Cultural Community Garden. They're this kind of varied involvement. So they have a single compost coordinator, but that person works really closely with a compost team who have sort of committed shifts to make sure that the compost gets turned, that there's any issues with the compost pile are taken care of, that sort of thing. So committed compost team, and then the compost generator. So that would be the people who are contributing their food scraps. Actually, do some of the building and turning themselves. So there are very clear instructions when they arrive at their. You can see on the right hand photo there, some tin perforated bins where they drop off their food scraps. There's another separate pile for browns. They throw it in there. That reduces the smell, but they also do a little bit of the processing right there. There's a shovel to chop up the food scraps, anything that's big. There's an auger there to kind of do some turning. So they are even an important part of that process. And then for larger tasks like sifting, compost sifting, pretty simple task, but takes a lot of time and work. And so they actually pull together compost work parties. So it's a kind of a fun activity. They have kind of entertaining, that kind of thing. They make it fun, but they have lots of hands there to help them out. And it's just a couple times a season. And then of course with all of these various levels, making sure that there's good communication about the duties and tasks that are needed, including, I cannot emphasize enough, very clear signage that really explains what needs to be done, because people are going to enter this at all different levels, and in-person orientation where it's possible, so that if people have questions and people can really see how the system works, that sort of thing. And then through all of this, just some things to keep in mind. Are there enough volunteers available for regular year-round management of your compost system? Now, the regular is the most important part of that. Consistency is needed, especially when you're food scrap composting, both in terms of the source. You're saying that you're going to take people's food scraps. Well, you need to have a place to put them. So if you start accepting food scraps, you need to consistently be able to accept them. And then also for just the management of the piles, also really important to have a consistent flow of volunteers. Some options in terms of, if you don't have year-round management support, you can look into some hybrid options, compost during the primary part of the season, and then haul scraps at the other part of the season to your local hauler compost system. Also looking into assessing the knowledge, skills, comfort level of all people involved. So is there other support needed, further training, sometimes even just at the source separation side of things, for the people who are contributing the food scraps, that ick factor that a lot of people deal with, making sure that you provide tips for reducing that ick factor, making things more simple for people. And then the very last thing I'll mention is that your system should be scaled which is what Athena is going to be talking about in just a moment, how you scale your system, kind of what your system looks like. Making sure that when you're thinking about that, your system should be scaled to the time people are willing and able to commit, and to your goals, whether that be how much material you wish to compost, whether that be education, like community engagement, as I mentioned earlier. Just making sure you keep the people and your goals in mind as you think about your system, the system itself. All right, and I'm going to pass it on to Athena now.
Morning, everybody. I hope you are all well this afternoon. Thank you very much for participating on this webinar. So I'm going to go over a lot of information in a very short time. If you are an old hat at composting, this should all be pretty much a review. If you're new to composting, don't get worried. It's a lot of information. Don't get frustrated. And we'll be here as technical advisors. We've got lots of resources for you, and we will be providing on-site trainings for you and can just be ready and available to assist with the composting effort. Okay, so getting started on feedstock collection. We're talking about all organics here, but all organics are not what it's going to be in your compost pile. So basically, an organics is anything that was once living, whether it was a tree or your sandwich or leaves, straw, etc. So for acceptable materials for your composting system, you want to take a look at what your system is, and we'll be going over this. One thing to consider is you really only want to accept meat in a hot composting process. So mostly we're talking to people about not accepting meat at first, and you can gradually add that if you get hot composting or as you're more comfortable. But again, if you're experienced, go ahead and add meat. Things you really want to stay away from though is like dog manures and cat manures. And there's, larger particles and things like that we'll be going over. On one of your handouts, we have this acceptable materials list in a handout form that you can use for your participants. So quality begins with the generator. There's an old adage, garbage in, garbage out. Well, for composting, it's organics in and compost out. That means you don't want plastics, you don't want trash, you don't want anything that's non-organic. So really need to pay attention to that, and that's part of what we're talking about today in terms of monitoring and signage and education. So for collection containers, and this is how you can keep material, gather your materials on site and how you'll collect your food scraps when people bring them in. I recommend a 5-gallon bucket or a tub or a 12 to maybe 32-gallon can or cart. Some people are using metal garbage cans. And then you always want some sawdust on hand as well. I recommend sawdust for covering the food scraps, and we'll go back over that. Bear in mind that food scraps get really heavy, so you don't want anything too big that you can't maneuver and put your food scraps in and then put those into your composting system. So you got to be able to handle that. So here's just some examples of people adding their food scraps and how they collect them for the community composting. So also you need to kind of train your participants. What are they going to put their food scraps in to bring them to your site? And so what I recommend is if you're not going to encourage them to buy a kitchen caddy like what's on the right side of your screen, or if you don't have those to give away for free, then you collect some samples of like kitty litter containers or yogurt containers or little tubs, or just have a list of containers they can buy at their local hardware store, because you'll want to help them get started with their kitchen collection so it's over the yuck factor. You can also encourage them to line their compost bins with either a paper sack or a newspaper or even bio bags, because these will compost even in a cold composting system. Also encourage them to rinse out their containers with vinegar. That helps keep fruit flies away. Okay, so collection monitoring really is your first point of making sure that you're only getting food scraps or soiled paper if you're taking that, napkins and such, and also to ensure that your compost operation is going to be successful. So you want to designate times and days for the food scrap collection. You want to tailor these to your participants. So you want to make sure that it's, you know, maybe a weekend morning or a weekday evening, so that you catch the most time available for your participants, but also your volunteers, because you really want to make sure that you have volunteers on site for any time you're accepting food scraps at your site. You don't want that to be unsupervised. So make sure that you post your collection times, make sure that word gets out to your participants. I'm assuming most of you will start with your garden or your community composters as your participants, so that should be an easy outlet. And then put that information on the sample handout that we have for a download, and we can tailor those for you as you need them. Here's just a couple examples of incorporating food scraps into your locations, a couple of different bin styles. So siting considerations, you really, as Libby mentioned, you want to make sure that your site and your system really match your goals and your site location and what are your needs around that. So here's just a couple of examples from around Vermont and one in New York City. So they're varying. You can do bins and tumblers and sheds and windrows. So again, you want to assess the volume of your materials, your community, how many participants you have. We really urge you to start small. Start with your local community, your participants, your gardeners, your community people using your compost. And then you can always grow from there. You really want to make sure that you have enough carbon sources to match your food scraps. You have enough people power to turn and to aerate and to manage the site. And then what's your room at your composting area? Do you have enough space for your composting needs? Remember, you can always grow. And then we have permit issues, and we're not permitted, and Natasha will go over those at the end of this presentation. So starting out, we encourage a lot of people to look at tumblers for at least one of the compost bins. These are great ways to manage food scraps. They're very easy to manage, very easy to rotate. They take the turning necessity out of composting. And they're also lockable and compostable. Many of them are insulated. They're vermin resistant and or vermin proof, and they're also odor and odor resistant, odor proof. So we will encourage you and work with you on looking at different tumblers. There's a lot out there. And then if you use a tumbler, you can either compost thoroughly in the tumbler, or you can make that part of another compost system. So again, a lot of sites also want to be an education or a demonstration site. So having a tumbler with some compost bins is a great idea. So there's lots of examples out there for those. And you can also use the shed system or a 3-bin system. And you start it off on one bin and then it goes to the next. And so there are all kinds of systems to match your needs and your methods and your goals. So windrow systems are used a lot in community composting, particularly on bigger sites. The one on the bottom left is what's called an aerated static window, and you can put a little motor on that, or it can be without a motor. It just helps aerate the piles. So again, just different methods and examples. And we'll be working with you to decide on what methods and systems will best meet your needs. So when you're planning your community composting site, you need to keep in mind several things. One is obviously your site and your composting method. Look at safety and fire emergency plans. Most likely your compost would never get hot enough to catch on fire, but it is something to be aware of. And in particular, where your site is, if you're located in a residential area, you'll need to look at security and vandalism issues, things like that. We will go over log recording. It's very important that you monitor your techniques, and your record keeping is vital. Provisions for controlling odors, what's going to happen if you get some odors, how can you manage those? And then a contingency plan is very important. What happens if your volunteers don't show up for food scrap collection? You have a mechanism in place for calling and letting people know that. How about the winter? Can you prepare for winter? What if it's snowing on your collection day? And things like that, sort of practical things to prepare for. Your site layout is, obviously important. You want to start with, where your materials are going to be received. Is this an easy access for your participants? For food scrap drop-off, do you have a container there for that? Where's your carbon storage? Your carbon storage should be right where your food scrap mixing area is, right where your compost bins are. It will need to be a dry area because you want to keep your carbon storage dry. It could be even in a pellet bin with a tarp over it. You have your active composting area, which is going to be pretty much, this is all in one area here, but you want to designate that as your active composting area. That will be your tumblers or your bins or your shed system, or all three. And then a curing. It's vital that you cure your compost. It's really not ready once it's gone through that active composting. It's not ready to use until it sits for 4 to 8 weeks at kind of a minimum. And that should be covered. It can even be covered in a tarp. It doesn't have to be in a bin. It can be in a pile. You do want to cover that though, so that you don't get weed growth and so you don't leach out the minerals in the compost through rain. And then your finished compost area. And both of these, all of these need signage on them so people know which area is which, and so they don't add new compost to the finished or curing compost. So here's just an example of a site layout. This is from the New York City Master Composter Manual. You do have that as one of your handouts, so be sure to take a look at that. It's a great, great, great resource. So you see, things have signage on them. Everybody's at work. They're, number 2 is their mixing area. You have your browns, your carbon sources in a separate bin. And then you have your active composting in the bins 3 and 4. 1 is the collection for the food scraps. So nice layout, and just gives you an example of how to set up your site. So when you're planning your site, you should have year-round accessibility. I know one community composting site is going to have 3 sites, and one will not have year-round accessibility. So they will be communicating with their participants about that. But food scraps don't stop. You don't stop eating in the middle of winter. So you do need a site that will have all of year-round accessibility. You need access to a water source, the hose. Most gardens will have that, but if you're not at a garden, you need that. If you can get shrubbery or fencing or cover to block wind, that's a good thing for insulating in the winter. For most bins and piles, you'll want to set that on the ground, grass or a vegetated area, because you need the microbes to come up from there. And then tumblers will typically be mounted, or they don't need to be touching the ground because you'll add soil to those. So preparing for winter, obviously in Vermont, is something we want to be able to do. You can insulate with hay barrels, or if you have shrubbery, or if you have a shed. If you can't do any of that, maybe put some hay bales around it, or at least the tarp. You can always put hay around the piles like this person's doing on the bottom. So setbacks are something really important for larger composting operations, but they also are important for community compost to bear in mind. You don't have to stick with the 100 and 200 recommended feet for larger composter operations, but do be aware that you don't want to set up your composting site near a well and near residences, or, of course, not anywhere near a stream or a pond or floodplain, because your materials can leach into the water, and that's something we don't want because of the high nitrogen and phosphorus that is in compost. particularly as you add food scraps. It's got too much nitrogen. So, and be aware of this for your good neighbor policy, which is something we'll be talking with you all about. And just be conscious of where your residences are and how you will locate your composting area. Maybe put a fence around it if it's a visible thing from residents, and there are other ways we can accommodate the setbacks. So equipment and supplies, if you're gardeners, mostly you're going to have all these things. And so basically, you know, shovel, a pitchfork is important. If you have a tumbler, if you're using a tumbler, get yourself a trawl, because that's handy for moving, mixing things around and putting sawdust in there and stuff like that. You want a covered area for your carbon storage, which we went over. And then a thermometer for hot composting, and we'll go over that in a minute. Signage, images and simple words are always best, and you want to be clear about the signage that you're using. Is this your food scrap drop-off area? Is it your active composting area? Is it your curing compost? Make sure all of these are labeled. I would recommend rainproof signage if you can do it, even laminated or plastic cover, or take a piece of wood and, you know, paint something on it. And be sure to have your list of acceptable materials at your drop-off site, either in the form of a handout for people, but also in a signage form. If you have a covered bulletin board, that's an excellent addition to the community composting site. So here's just an example. These folks have a metal signage, and they have their food scraps area and how they do it, and just you know, information about their garden. So composting is a natural process that happens in our woods, it happens in vegetated areas, it happens all around the world. And what we do as composters is we control this system. So, and how we control it is we manage it, and we put in the proper right amount of ingredients to make it expeditious, and then we control the process, and then we utilize the end product. So basically you have organic materials going in, food scraps, carbon sources, brown materials, etc., water and mineral nutrients and microorganisms. They create this high energy as they eat the stuff, and then out goes the compost, the finished product. So our buddies in compost are all the creatures that you see in this picture. And what we're doing is we're feeding these creatures. We give them energy. And when they get active in eating, particularly the microorganisms, the fungi and the bacteria, they give off energy. And so that heats up the composting pile, and that helps with decomposition. And the more we manage our pile and ensure that we get the right kind of ingredients in there, the faster the process happens. So you bear in mind that composting is a living system. And so our whole goal is to make compost, our compost system, to feed and to manage these living creatures. So just like us, they need certain things. So elements of composting then, just like us, one is air. This is an aerobic process, so meaning with air. So they need air, and that's why we're turning it or rotating it in our bin. They need a carbon to nitrogen ratio, which means materials high in carbon and materials high in nitrogen, and we'll go over that in a minute. So, and then also moisture, just like us, they need water, but they don't need too much water because they will drown, but they need enough to be able to breathe and to use for an energy source and to have moisture. So basically your compost wants to be uniformly like a damp sponge. So your optimum pH range, and you don't have to really worry about this too much as long as you put in the proper diversity of food scraps and such, that'll come out. And then temperature, if all your materials and your water and your aeration is in place, your temperature will rise. So this will happen as a product of your composting system and you and your volunteers. So the basic composting recipe is 2 to 3 parts carbon. We love carbon because it's essential, and in particular for managing food scraps. So your carbon sources, I really recommend you get at least a small supply of sawdust, but also leaves, soil paper, shredded paper can do, wood shavings. If you're going to use branches, they need to be chopped and shredded because you don't want big materials. Your nitrogen is your green materials, your kitchen scraps, grass clippings, garden trimmings, preferably no weeds, or manures, livestock manures. You want to keep it small. So here's your example. If you're going to accept 1 bucket of nitrogen, so 1 bucket of food scraps, you're going to need 3 volumes of carbon for that. Now, tumblers take a little less. And so if you've got a tumbler, putting sawdust in it will really do pretty well. And then you can add some leaves to it. So before you start, though, you really need to make sure you have enough carbon sources on hand to make everything work. So you always add a little bit of soil because that inoculates your recipe with appropriate microbes. And again, the moisture, you really need to have that moisture there. So tips, make sure you mix materials. You want a homogeneous mix to feed the critters. When you're adding food scraps, try to make your balance so that it's not more than 20%, particularly to start, just because food scraps can cause odor. And you get to a point where all you need to do is really observe your compost to make it happy, and you look and feel and do trial and error as such. So aeration techniques, if you have a tumbler, all you do is close the lid and rotate it. If you're using a pile or a bin, you can put perforated pipes down at the bottom, and those will help you to aerate it. And you also just lift it up with a pitchfork and just aerate it every couple of days, depending on your temperature and your system. For hot composting, what you really want to do is you want an enclosed container. You need it insulated in the winter, and you need it large enough to have your volume. Excuse me. If you're doing the pile, you really want to insulate it, cover it with a tarp or hay, and you want your proper mix of feedstocks. You really need to make sure you have your carbon and your nitrogen sources mixing to the appropriate amounts. If for hot compost, your temperatures should at least rise to 120, 130 for 3 to 15 days to kill off pathogens and weed seeds. And turning and rotating that once or twice a week will achieve that. So my model, be one with your compost. Troubleshooting. So through observations and monitoring your process, you should be able to handle anything that comes your way, and hopefully not much will come your way in terms of issues or trouble. You know, when you're observing, are the bins or piles, are they steaming? Are they heating up? Is decomposition occurring? If decomposition isn't occurring, your bins are most likely too dry or your materials are too dry. So if it's not turning to soil and the food scraps aren't disappearing in a couple of days, then you need to turn your materials, make sure it's moist enough. If there's a really strong odor, really good compost will not smell. It's going to smell if there's food scraps are not composting, or if it gets matted down and the process doesn't have enough air. So if any of these issues arise, then you need to act quickly. The compost feel, do the squeeze test, make sure it all feels like a damp sponge. Does it kind of stick together but not dripping wet? Oxygen, again, smelling and odor is going to be your key to oxygen. If you're not getting enough oxygen, chances are it's going to be smelly. It'll smell like putrid food scraps because they're not getting enough odor to decompose, and the microorganisms are not there because they're not getting enough air. So you want to turn your pile at that point. And then temperature monitoring. Your temperatures should rise. If they don't, you know, it's not too much of a deal. If they don't get 131, but maybe they rise over 100, cold composting is fine, especially to get started. So there's tricks to making that happen as well. So, and again, these are just tips, and we'll be reviewing this as we work with you over the next couple of years through your pilots. so don't get worried yet. Logbooks, we will design sample logbooks to best meet your individual needs at your composting sites, but these are some of the things that you'll want to bear in mind when you're keeping a logbook. For your logbook, you'll want to make sure that it can be kept dry and in a common place so your key volunteers will have access to it. Every time they turn the bin, it should be noted and take the temperature. Were there any issues? You'll want to be weighing your food scraps so that we get a sense of what's coming in and then the weight of the compost going out. So we'll be talking with you about that, but just bear in mind to kind of plan for a location for this. Quality assurance is really how you observe and monitor and test your compost, keep an accurate record. And training your team is always essential. So again, tips to review: have adequate amounts of carbon, always cover your food scraps with carbon, wood shavings work best, or sawdust. If you get issues with fruit flies and vermin, covering with sawdust and even lime can help. For those of you using compost bins, you'll want to line your bin with wire mesh, and then we do have instructions on that. This will help to deter vermin. Again, starting your food scraps in a compost tumbler will help to eliminate that issue, and then you can always finish your composting in a compost bin, and that'll be a great system that way, and then that will deter the vermin because the smells won't be there. And then remember to use vinegar to wash out your collection containers, because that'll just keep out down odors. If you do have issues with vermin, eliminate any meat. If you have a bear issue that comes around in February or March, stop putting food scraps in your bins for a little bit. Make sure you're always covering your food scraps as you add them to your tumbler or your system with the sawdust to keep down the odors. And then in some areas you may need to build an enclosure around your compost area, because that's not going to be avoidable to have if you have a critter issue. So these things you'll want to think about now, and typically maybe just put in your compost area in an enclosure. All right, Natasha. Oh, and remember everybody to put your questions type your questions in the box.
Great, thank you everybody. Thank you, Athena and Libby. And oh, there we go. One moment, let me just get to the right slide.
And while Natasha's doing that, please remember to download the handouts that are on your in the box there. And also, you will be receiving a survey at the end of the webinar and/or via email from GoToWebinar. We'd appreciate your input on that. It's just 2 questions. And then I will be sending out the hyperlinks to the PowerPoints and the recording, so you can distribute that to your compost volunteers and keep it on hand for later viewing.
Great. Thank you very much, Athena. Thanks for bearing with me on that. So here, really what we wanted to, oops, sorry. Here, what we really just wanted to note was that most community composting sites do not require permitting. So here we're talking about somewhere between backyard and commercial scale. As long as your sites are staying less than that 100 cubic yards per year of feedstocks, you don't need to be concerned with permits in Vermont. I also just wanted to emphasize that when you're getting started, especially if you're new to it, if you start small, any issues that come up or things that don't go quite as planned will also be small. So as you get the management system worked out, you can then start refining your compost recipe and then increase your capacity over time. Then we just wanted to move on to our contact information, or who you can call for support in composting. Our contact, Libby, Athena's, and my contact information is all on that flyer. And then there's also the Extension Master Composters, who have a lot of volunteers around the state, and solid waste management districts also have a lot of resources and can often help out. So if you have questions, one of the questions that I see so far is just where the handouts are. On that side panel below questions, there's a handouts. You should see a little gray box that says handouts. If you open that up, you can download the handouts directly.
Yeah, just click on the hyperlink there. It should come down.
Yeah. If you haven't had a chance to post your questions yet, feel free to do so, or you can reach out afterwards to one of us by email or phone, and we'll be happy to assist you.
What other states have community composting sites?
Gosh, I think a lot of them do. Libby, I don't know if you want to answer this with some, I know you, in terms of community gardens, you've.
It's a great question. I actually don't know specifically the answer. I know that there's some really great systems nearby in the Northeast here. Specifically, we referenced quite a few times New York City. They just have a really dedicated system that Master Composter Guide is really directed towards community garden based and more kind of like true community composting, small scale sites like we're talking about here. But that's mostly what I know. Beyond that, I'm not sure.
Chicago has a number of sites. They're very much concentrated now in urban areas. So Vermont will pave the way for rural small towns. But I know Chicago has some. I know New Orleans has some because I did include some pictures of those. Washington, D.C. is looking at a model similar to New York City. New York City has well over 35 community composting sites in the city. Washington, D.C. is looking at a similar model to at least start their food scrap diversion for the area. And then I know there's a number of community composting also around the Northwest and California. So we're not alone.
We have another question about whether any of us know about community composting that uses worms, so vermiculture. I don't offhand. I don't know, Athena or Libby, if you do.
I do not, but I have worked with a number of farmers who utilize vermicomposting, and it's certainly done a lot in Canada. So if you want specifics on outdoor composting, I can certainly advise on that. And that's an interesting question for research. We will be putting together a resource list and some other guide manual kind of materials. So that'll be something that we can research and be sure to include in our resource list.
The only other thing I would add to that is I know that some of the New York City sites, I believe that there are a few that do vermicomposting, some that are experimenting with bokashi, which is another style of composting as well. And I believe on their website, and we can send this and follow up resources, but that they have some information on what's involved at different sites, and you can actually do a self-guided tour of their community composting sites when they're open for hours. So if you're ever in the New York City area, there might be some interesting samples there for you to look at.
So Athena, there's another question asking whether they should plan to get their finished compost tested when they're done, as they're refining their recipes.
Yes, I always recommend compost getting tested. It's very easy to do. You can do a simple one, just like a soil test. And that's some of the information that we can provide in terms of where you send your compost sample to get it tested.
Another question is whether we'll be able to provide or help out with language, explaining to participants that community composting doesn't necessarily mean open to the entire community. And the answer to that is absolutely. We're putting together sort of guidelines for good neighbor tips in terms of how to communicate to your neighbors what you're doing. And part of that is just being really clear the scope and the reasoning behind starting small. So, you know, it's not a full community drop off for food scraps necessarily. Let's see.
And just to add to that, when you start your composting system and operation, you know, you clearly want to let your neighbors know, and you can explain to them that you're just starting out with your community volunteers right now because, you know, we're going to handle that, you know, but we'll be excited to invite you on down the line. And then also your education, just, you know, in all your education, make sure that you're aware that people are aware that they have to be trained and invited to participate.
We have another question asking if it's a good idea to quantify the amount of food scraps you will collect based on the capacity of your bin systems, and how would you do those calculations? How can you say, looking at the volume of your bin or your tumbler, how do you know how much you can capacitize?
Usually the tumblers will tell you, and also for your 3-bin system, there are calculations, and we can certainly provide those in our handouts. Starting small is always the best, though.
And you don't, also just to reemphasize that, you don't necessarily need to fill your bin or tumbler to capacity right when you're first starting. It will, you know, food scraps will always be coming in, so you can increase that, but you don't have to worry about, you know, just maxing it out right on the first collection day or two.
And bear in mind that food scraps will start decomposing and everything will start going down by 50 to 60% in volume within a few days. So you don't have to be too concerned about that. I do know A&R has a good calculation handout. It's a little more toward farm operations and a little big operations, but that could be something we could adapt for communities too.
Are there any other questions? All right. Well, if you think of any, please feel free to reach out to one of us. And I'd just like to thank you all again for coming and joining us for today's webinar. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Please do our survey and look out for the hyperlinks, and we will answer any other questions. So if you have any, feel free to email myself or Libby or Natasha.
Thanks.